Director Vesa Corinth had spent 9 years building the most comprehensive weakness assessment in Ostrankei Directorate history, 4,000 pages cataloging every human psychological vulnerability her intelligence division could identify, and she discovered, on the day she finally submitted it for approval, that humanity had already read it, not stolen it, not intercepted it, written half of it themselves, feeding her agency false vulnerabilities for the better part of a decade, and Vesa Corinth would spend the rest of her career trying to explain to a furious directorate council exactly how 9 years of meticulous intelligence work had become, without her ever noticing, someone else's weapon. The Ostrankei Directorate had never lost an intelligence war. In 800 years of methodical, patient expansion across the galactic arm, they had conquered through knowledge rather than force, identifying the specific psychological, social, and structural fractures within any target civilization, and exploiting them with surgical precision, avoiding the costly, unpredictable business of open warfare entirely. Their Strategic Vulnerability Division employed the finest analytical minds the Directorate produced, and Vesa Corinth, at 41, had risen to lead it faster than any director in the division's recorded history, precisely because her instincts for finding a civilization's breaking point had never once failed her. She had approached humanity's file with the same methodical confidence that had defined her entire career. Earth civilization presented, on the surface, an unusually rich vulnerability landscape, fractured politically across competing nation-states, historically prone to catastrophic internal conflict, culturally obsessed with status hierarchies that seemed, to her trained analytical eye, almost designed for exploitation. She had assigned a team of 40 analysts to the project, embedding intelligence assets across human digital networks, cultivating human sources who believed, in every documented case, that they were providing information to a rival nation's intelligence service rather than an alien directorate preparing eventual contact. The work had proceeded, for the first 6 years, exactly as her considerable experience predicted. Her analysts identified fracture point after fracture point, economic inequality that could be deliberately inflamed, political polarization that responded predictably to targeted informational pressure, historical grievances between human nations that, properly cultivated, could reliably produce exactly the kind of internal conflict that made conquest, when the Directorate eventually chose to pursue it, almost unnecessary. It was her senior analyst, a meticulous researcher named Threll Osvin, who had spent 11 years specifically studying human intelligence tradecraft, who first noticed the pattern that would eventually unravel everything Vesa Corinth believed she had built. "Director, I need you to review something," Threll said, arriving at her office 8 years into the project with a data file he had clearly spent considerable time deciding whether to present at all. "I've been cross-referencing our human source network against publicly available information humanity has, over the past several years, allowed to circulate through channels our sources specifically flagged as high confidence and low risk. I've found 17 instances where information our sources provided, information we subsequently built strategic assessments around, later proved either partially inaccurate or, in several cases, directly contradicted by information that surfaced through entirely separate channels months afterward." Vesa Corinth reviewed the data with the careful, methodical attention that had defined her entire career, and felt, for the first time in 8 years of leading the Human Assessment Project, the specific cold unease of a professional confronting evidence that fundamentally contradicted her own confident assumptions. "You are suggesting our source network has been compromised," she said. "I am suggesting something I find considerably more difficult to prove, Director, and considerably more unsettling to consider," Threll said. "I do not believe our sources have been compromised in the conventional sense, where a hostile intelligence service discovers and neutralizes an existing asset. The pattern I'm observing suggests something closer to deliberate cultivation. Sources that were remarkably easy to recruit, remarkably willing to provide sensitive information, and remarkably consistent in providing exactly the kind of vulnerability data our analytical framework was specifically designed to prioritize. I have begun to wonder, Director, whether we recruited these sources at all, or whether we were, from the very beginning, offered them. Vesa Corinth dismissed the concern initially, not out of complacency, but because her considerable professional experience had taught her that intelligence work inevitably produced exactly this kind of unsettling ambiguity, sources whose reliability could never be fully verified, patterns that could be read as sinister or entirely coincidental depending on how much analytical weight one chose to assign them. She ordered additional verification work, expecting, based on 8 years of otherwise successful intelligence gathering, that Threll's concerns would prove, upon deeper investigation, to be the kind of professional paranoia that eventually afflicted every sufficiently experienced intelligence analyst. The deeper investigation, conducted over the following 14 months, produced instead a picture considerably more alarming than either Vesa Corinth or Threll Osvin had initially suspected. Humanity, it gradually became clear, had detected the Directorate's intelligence gathering operation not years into its execution, but within the first several months, through methods Vesa Corinth's own considerable expertise struggled to fully reconstruct even after extensive investigation. Rather than attempting to shut down or expel the operation, a response her own doctrine would have considered the obvious defensive choice. Humanity's own intelligence apparatus had made a considerably more sophisticated calculation, one that reflected, Vesa Corinth would eventually conclude, a strategic patience her species' considerable conquest experience had genuinely never prepared her to anticipate. They had allowed the operation to continue, and they had begun, almost immediately, feeding it exactly what it wanted to find. "This is Operation Mirror Glass," explained Director Patricia Ndiaye, the human intelligence coordinator who would eventually meet with Vesa Corinth under diplomatic circumstances, considerably more formal than either woman could have anticipated during the years their respective agencies had spent locked in an entirely one-sided intelligence war neither government officially acknowledged. "We detected your Directorate's initial reconnaissance activity within 4 months of its establishment. Through a signals anomaly, one of our own analysts happened to notice almost by accident. Our first instinct, honestly, was to shut it down entirely. Roll up the operation, expel whatever assets we could identify, treat it as the straightforward espionage threat it appeared to be on the surface." "What changed that assessment?" Vesa Corinth asked, still processing the full scope of what 9 years of confident intelligence work had actually represented. "A fairly simple realization once we sat with it long enough," Patricia said. "If we shut the operation down immediately, we'd learn almost nothing about who was actually watching us, or why, or what they intended to eventually do with whatever they learned. But if we let it continue and we controlled, carefully and patiently, exactly what it was allowed to find, we could learn considerably more about our observers than they ever learned about us. It's an old technique, honestly, older than either of our civilization's modern intelligence services. You don't always shut down a hostile intelligence operation the moment you find it. Sometimes you let it keep operating, and you turn it into a mirror instead, showing your adversary exactly what you want them to see, while you quietly study everything about how they see it." Vesa Corinth spent considerable time, in the following weeks, reconstructing the full scope of what 9 years of what she had believed was rigorous, independent intelligence analysis had actually represented, a discovery that would fundamentally reshape not merely her own career, but the Directorate's broader strategic understanding of humanity's civilizational capability. Every major vulnerability her analysts had identified, the economic fracture points, the political polarization patterns, the historical grievances she had assessed as ripe for exploitation, had been, to varying degrees, deliberately cultivated and presented to her intelligence network by a human counter-operation that had understood, with unsettling precision, exactly what kind of vulnerability assessment framework an alien intelligence agency would be looking for. "You didn't simply feed us false information," she said to Patricia Ndii during their third formal diplomatic exchange, her professional composure fraying in a manner her considerable career had rarely required. "You fed us information calibrated specifically to our own analytical methodology. Vulnerabilities that appeared genuine, that our verification protocols confirmed through multiple independent sources, that fit precisely within the theoretical framework our species conquest doctrine has always used to assess target civilizations. This required not merely understanding that you were being observed, but understanding, in considerable detail, exactly how we think." "That's not entirely accurate," Patricia said. "We didn't understand how your species thinks, not specifically, not for most of the operation. What we understood, considerably earlier and considerably more thoroughly, was how intelligence agencies think, generally, regardless of species. We've spent the better part of a century running exactly this kind of operation against other human nations, long before you ever arrived in our system. Feed a hostile intelligence service information that confirms what their own analytical framework already expects them to find, and they'll rarely look hard enough to question whether the confirmation is genuine. That's not a uniquely human insight about how your species processes information, Director. It's a fairly universal insight about how intelligence analysis works, regardless of who's conducting it. We didn't need to understand the Ostrankei Directorate specifically. We just needed to understand that whoever was watching us would eventually build a theory about what makes us vulnerable. And once we understood the shape of that theory, giving them exactly the confirmation they were looking for turned out to be considerably easier than you'd expect. The revelation generated, within the Ostrankei Directorate's senior command structure, a strategic crisis considerably more significant than the specific intelligence failure itself represented. Vesa Corinth's 4,000-page vulnerability assessment, the document that had been scheduled for final approval as the foundational strategic framework for the Directorate's eventual approach to human contact, was revealed to be, in substantial part, a document humanity itself had quietly authored, embedding within it exactly the strategic assumptions that would prove most catastrophically wrong should the Directorate ever attempt to act upon them. "Explain to this council," demanded High Counselor Osrek Vantel, presiding over an emergency session convened specifically to address the crisis, precisely how 9 years of dedicated intelligence work, conducted by our most experienced analysts, using verification protocols refined across 8 centuries of successful conquest doctrine, produced a strategic assessment that our target civilization had substantially authored themselves, without a single analyst in your division ever identifying the deception. Vesa Corinth stood before the council with the particular exposed vulnerability of a career built on confident expertise, now forced to account for its most significant failure, and offered an answer that would, in the following years, fundamentally reshape the Directorate's entire approach to intelligence operations against technologically comparable civilizations. "Because humanity did not attempt to deceive us about who they were, Counselor," she said. "That would have been detectable, eventually, through the kind of rigorous cross-verification our protocols are specifically designed to catch. Instead, they deceived us about what we would find valuable to discover, which is a considerably more sophisticated form of deception, one our analytical framework had no established protocol for detecting, because it does not require lying about the target civilization at all. It only requires understanding in advance exactly what theory the observing intelligence service will construct, and then providing evidence that confirms that theory so precisely that no analyst, however experienced, has sufficient reason to question it. We were not deceived about humanity, counselor. We were deceived about our own analytical process, led to believe we were conducting independent verification when we were, in fact, being carefully guided toward conclusions humanity had already decided we should reach. The Council's subsequent investigation, extending over the following 18 months, uncovered the full scope of what would eventually be classified, within Directorate intelligence circles, as the most sophisticated counterintelligence operation any target civilization had ever successfully executed against Ostrankai's strategic assessment doctrine. Human intelligence services, it became clear, had not merely detected and manipulated the Directorate's reconnaissance operation. They had used the operation itself as a training exercise, studying, across 9 years of careful observation, exactly how an alien intelligence service processed information, verified sources, and constructed strategic theory, developing in the process a considerably more sophisticated understanding of Ostrankai analytical methodology than the Directorate itself had ever developed about humanity's actual civilizational capabilities. "You were never actually trying to hide your weaknesses from us," Vesa Corinth said, during what would become her final formal exchange with Patricia Ndii, before diplomatic protocols shifted the ongoing relationship to considerably more senior officials on both sides. "You understood from very early in the operation that convincing us we had successfully identified genuine vulnerabilities would prove considerably more valuable than simply concealing them, because false confidence in flawed intelligence produces considerably worse strategic outcomes than honest uncertainty ever could." "That's most of it, yes," Patricia said. "Though I want to be honest with you about something else too, Director, now that we're finally having this conversation without either of our governments technically pretending it isn't happening. We didn't just want to feed you bad information. We wanted to understand who you actually were underneath the operation, because eventually, one way or another, actual contact was always going to happen, and we needed to understand what kind of civilization we'd eventually be negotiating with. 9 years of watching how your Directorate constructs intelligence assessments, what theories your analysts default toward, what evidence convinces them, and what evidence gets dismissed, taught us considerably more about how the Ostrankai Directorate actually thinks than any single vulnerability assessment about our own civilization could have possibly taught you about us. You spent 9 years building a file on humanity's weaknesses. We spent those same 9 years building a considerably more useful file, one about exactly how your intelligence services construct confidence, and exactly what kind of evidence it takes to convince them they've found what they're looking for." Vesa Corinth's formal report to the Directorate Council, submitted at the conclusion of the 18-month investigation, and eventually incorporated into revised intelligence doctrine, taught across every subsequent generation of Strategic Vulnerability Division analysts, represented a fundamental reconsideration of assumptions that 800 years of successful conquest doctrine had never previously required the Directorate to question. "Our conquest doctrine has always depended on a foundational assumption. Our considerable historical success record has never previously forced us to examine," she wrote, "that superior technological and strategic sophistication reliably produces superior intelligence-gathering outcomes against less advanced target civilizations, and that a sufficiently patient, sufficiently well-resourced reconnaissance operation will eventually construct an accurate vulnerability assessment regardless of the target civilization's own intelligence capabilities." This assumption failed catastrophically against humanity, not because our operational tradecraft was deficient by any conventional measure, but because humanity possessed something our doctrine had never previously needed to account for in a pre-contact target civilization: a sufficiently sophisticated understanding of intelligence methodology, developed across nearly a century of their own internal espionage conflicts, to recognize our reconnaissance operation almost immediately and to construct, with considerable patience and precision, a counter-operation specifically designed to exploit our own analytical process rather than simply concealing information from it. We did not fail to find humanity's weaknesses because those weaknesses do not exist. Every civilization carries genuine vulnerabilities, and humanity is almost certainly no exception. We failed because humanity understood, with a sophistication our doctrine had never previously encountered from a pre-contact species, that the most effective defense against a superior intelligence-gathering apparatus is not concealment, but the patient, deliberate cultivation of confident, well-verified, catastrophically incorrect conclusions. The Directorate's broader diplomatic posture toward Earth shifted substantially in the years following the investigation's conclusion, moving away from the confident, vulnerability exploitation framework that had governed the entire 9-year reconnaissance operation, toward a considerably more cautious approach that acknowledged, for the first time in the Directorate's 800-year conquest history, genuine uncertainty about whether their considerable strategic advantages would translate into the kind of decisive outcome their historical experience with less sophisticated target civilizations had always previously produced. Vesa Corinth, despite the professional consequences her division's most significant intelligence failure might have been expected to generate, was retained in her position, a decision High Counselor Vantil justified through reasoning that would itself become a frequently cited principle within subsequent Directorate intelligence doctrine. You are, as far as this council can determine, the single Ostrunkai official who currently possesses the most thorough, hard-won understanding of exactly how sophisticated a pre-contact civilization's counterintelligence capability can prove to be, he told her, during the formal proceedings that concluded the investigation. We do not consider this failure a demonstration of inadequate professional capability, Director. We consider it the most valuable intelligence the Directorate has gathered about humanity in 9 years of operation, precisely because it teaches us something our doctrine has never previously needed to learn, that the absence of detectable weakness in our own analytical framework does not confirm the accuracy of our conclusions. It may simply confirm that our adversary understood, in considerable and unsettling detail, exactly what kind of evidence would prevent us from ever questioning them at all. Vesa Corinth requested. In the years following the investigation's formal conclusion, direct involvement in the Directorate's ongoing diplomatic relationship with Earth, a request granted specifically because her hard-earned understanding of exactly how thoroughly humanity's counterintelligence operation had succeeded made her, in the Council's ultimate assessment, uniquely qualified to navigate a relationship that could no longer proceed under the Directorate's traditional assumption of unquestioned analytical superiority. She met with Patricia Ndii periodically over the following years, in meetings that gradually transformed from the tense, formally adversarial exchanges of their initial post-revelation encounters into something considerably closer to genuine professional respect between two intelligence officials who had each spent their careers mastering a craft the other had, in this particular instance, proven considerably more skilled at practicing. I keep returning to one specific question, Vesa Corinth said, during one of their later meetings, held in a neutral diplomatic facility that had become, over the years, the regular venue for exchanges neither government fully classified as either adversarial or cooperative. 9 years is a considerable investment of resources and patience for any intelligence operation, particularly one directed at an adversary whose actual conquest intentions, at the time your operation began, remained entirely speculative. You could not have known, with any certainty, that the Directorate intended eventual hostile action against Earth. Why commit such extensive resources to studying an intelligence-gathering operation whose ultimate purpose remained, from your own perspective, genuinely uncertain? Patricia Ndii considered the question with the same measured, unhurried thoughtfulness she had brought to every exchange across their unusual professional relationship, and offered an answer that Vesa Corinth would eventually include, in a heavily redacted form, within her own final report on the entire affair. Because uncertainty about an adversary's ultimate intentions has never once, in the entire history of human intelligence work, been a reasonable justification for uncertainty about how carefully we should study them, Patricia said. We didn't need to know for certain that your directorate intended conquest, Director. We only needed to understand that a civilization with the technological capability to reach our system quietly, gather intelligence about us for years without our knowledge, and construct detailed vulnerability assessments about our species, represented exactly the kind of uncertainty that deserved our most careful, most patient attention, regardless of what conclusions we eventually drew about your actual intentions. That's not a uniquely clever strategic insight, honestly. It's just the same basic principle every human intelligence service has operated under for as long as intelligence services have existed. You don't wait until you're certain a threat is real before you start understanding it thoroughly. By the time you're certain, understanding it thoroughly is usually no longer an option you have time left to pursue. The Ostrankei Directorate's formal doctrine regarding pre-contact intelligence operations underwent substantial revision in the years following the investigation's conclusion, a revision that would come to be known, within subsequent generations of Strategic Vulnerability Division training, simply as the Corinth Protocol, a set of analytical safeguards specifically designed to prevent the exact failure that had unraveled 9 years of confident intelligence work. Vesa Corinth herself, delivering a lecture to a new class of Directorate intelligence analysts nearly a decade after the investigation's conclusion, offered a summary of the lesson that would define the remainder of her considerable career. We spent 9 years believing we were studying humanity's weaknesses, she told the assembled analysts, standing before a room of officers considerably younger than she had been when her own confident assumptions about human vulnerability had first begun their long, unraveling collapse. We were correct, in one narrow, technical sense. We did learn a great deal about human weakness during those 9 years, though not, as it eventually turned out, about humanity's weaknesses at all. We learned in exhaustive, humbling detail about our own. Every assumption we brought into that operation, every analytical shortcut our considerable historical success had taught us to trust without sufficient scrutiny, every piece of confirming evidence we accepted a little too readily, because it fit a theory we already wanted to believe. Humanity found every single one of those vulnerabilities in our own methodology, faster and more thoroughly than we ever found a single genuine vulnerability in theirs. I do not tell you this story to suggest humanity is somehow unbeatable, or that the Directorate's considerable strategic advantages count for nothing against a sufficiently determined pre-contact civilization. I tell you this story because it taught me something I believe every analyst in this division needs to understand before they ever construct another vulnerability assessment against any target civilization, human or otherwise. The most dangerous adversary you will ever study is not the one whose weaknesses you cannot find. It is the one patient enough and clever enough to understand exactly what weaknesses you are looking for, and generous enough to hand you precisely those weaknesses, wrapped in just enough genuine-seeming evidence that you never think to ask whether you found them yourself, or whether they were simply waiting all along for you to come looking. She paused, allowing the room's uncomfortable silence to settle fully before delivering the lecture's final observation, one that would, in the years following, become perhaps the single most frequently quoted line within the entire Directorate's revised intelligence training curriculum. We studied every weakness we believed humanity possessed, she said. It took us 9 years and considerable resources and the dedicated effort of some of the finest analysts our division has ever produced. Humanity, meanwhile, spent those same 9 years studying us, and they did not need 9 years to succeed. They needed only to understand, correctly and completely, from nearly the very first moment they detected our operation, exactly what we already believed about ourselves, and exactly how much confidence that belief would eventually cost us. That is not a lesson about human weakness, gentlemen. That is a lesson about ours, and I would strongly advise every analyst in this room to spend considerably more time studying it than I was ever willing to spend, across 9 long and expensive years, studying anyone else's.